Hey, Money Crew. Welcome to the Locums Lounge. Are you a physician who is feeling burned out? Are you tired of working endless hours without having the opportunity to reboot and recharge? Do you wish you could negotiate more money and work on your own terms? Are you interested or kind of heard of locum tenens work but aren't quite sure where to get started? If you answered yes to any of these questions, then let me be the first to tell you that this podcast is just for you. I am your host, Dr. Mimi, board certified emergency medicine physician, locum tenens expert, and full-time locums doc. I am also your take back coach. This podcast will inspire you to take back your career and practice medicine on your own terms. I will help you to successfully develop the strategies that will help you break free from the mindset that you work for your job and instead take back your career and let your job work for you. You can be happy while practicing medicine. You can avoid burnout, and yes, you absolutely can make more money. All right, well, let's get into it. Today, I'm excited to welcome Dr. Mark Royer, ENT surgeon, MBA, and physician leader with Specialty Locums. Mark's journey is a powerful example of what can happen when physicians stop viewing locums as just temporary coverage and start seeing it as a platform for ownership, autonomy, and entrepreneurship. He's navigated the transition from full-time clinical practice into building physician-led solutions in the locum space. And today we're unpacking what that really looks like behind the scenes. So thank you, Mark, for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Dr. Goldsmith. I'm really excited to be here. I had the pleasure of chatting with you on our podcast a few months ago, and am so excited that we get to talk again because I learned a lot from you, and I really have, of course, enjoyed your content and am looking forward to chatting with you some more.
Yes, absolutely. Same here. So before Specialty Locums and before Locums became an entrepreneurial vehicle for you, what was the moment or tension in your career that made you realize the traditional physician path wasn't enough and that you needed to build something different?
Well, my first exposure to locums actually came when my wife and I, who's also ear, nose, and throat surgeon, we started in practice together right out of residency. We are at a regional hospital. We were the only ENTs there, and we realized pretty soon that being on call 24/7 was not a ideal setup for us, especially we share a travel passion with our kids as you do. And but even before we had kids, when we were getting ready to have our babies, we're like, okay, well, who's going to be covering the ER? Who's going to be covering our patients? And that's when I first started learning about locums because the hospital was bringing in locums, ear, nose, and throat surgeons in order to cover our practice. And around that time that we were doing that, life was crazy, having kids, traveling, building that practice. I started working on my MBA as well. And I think I had a lot of the frustrations that a number of docs experience when they're employed that continued to kind of feel like it was conflicting with the kind of best patient care you can give, being caught up in that system and realizing when you're employed, you really don't have much autonomy. I mean, ultimately, you are answerable to not just your peers and your patients and your medical boards, but administrators who often aren't the most well-equipped and often don't have the patient's best interest in mind. So it was kind of this growing conflict that I felt. And when I was working on my MBA, I was like, I think that this is something that we could do. I feel like we could start our own practice. And so that's kind of how I decided to kind of take a step away from traditional employment, which is, how we had started out. And we've never really looked back since that point. That was about 10 years ago.
That's awesome. That is awesome. So tell me, so do you have your own ENT practice that you supply or that you fulfill contracts for in locums? Tell me a little bit more about that.
Yeah, sure. So we going from being employed to then transitioning to more of a private practice model. We were kind of doing a couple things in parallel. One of those was our private practice, but the other one was actually a company that my wife Allison Royer had started even a few years before we were together. More of a consulting kind of ENT type company that wasn't super well defined what we are going to use that for. But as we were using locums, we saw that many of these docs who came in became very good friends of ours, right? And so we knew what the hospital was paying these massive locums companies, and we knew what the doc was getting paid. And the whole point of business is to create value and to find value. And I realized that once I started thinking in those terms. And I mean, often the docs were getting half or less of what the locums company was charging the hospital. And I knew that there had to be a better way to pay the docs more, to charge hospitals less. And so we started workshopping that and kind of started from there. And when we first started, not only did I know that the physician payment by the locums companies was being artificially lowered because there were just a few players in the field, but I also knew that there was going to be a great need for call coverage, is what kind of the thought was. Because there are a lot of practices that, in my specialty at least, and I think this was true in a lot of surgical subspecialty practices, and hell, even in primary care practices, that were independent groups. And then, maybe they had a couple of partners nearing retirement. It was harder for them to recruit in new docs. They were taking employee jobs like I was at that time. And they were then selling their practices to their local hospitals and becoming employed themselves. And what I saw happening was you'd have a group of 5 that would go to a group of 4, and then be a group of 3 through retirements or matriculation. And then ultimately the time would come around for that employment contract to be renewed. And usually there was pressure on their RVU number. There was pressure on their overall compensation. There was pressure on their productivity. And then at the same time, they were on call more frequently. And oftentimes there wasn't compensation for that call. So what Allie came up with was this idea that, well, why don't we, when the pushback that we're getting all the time is, okay, I want to be paid fair market value for my RVUs or my call compensation, and usually that's used by hospitals to lower your comp. And so her thought was, well, why don't we say, okay, that's fine, but we should also have fair market value quality of life. And that included not being on call every other weekend or every third weekend. You do your duty as a physician to provide call to your community and to your hospital. But once it starts to be overly burdensome, or it's, you're on call half the time or a third of the time, that seemed to be a little too much. So we really worked with physicians that we knew in our specialty to help them advocate to have call coverage locums be brought in, and then ideally through our company, because we had quite a network of ear, nose, and throat doctors who were looking for those types of opportunities. And we knew that if we used our physician network, we wouldn't have to employ recruiters. So there's one expense that we can pass right back to the docs. And then we also knew that there was no reason to take such huge margins. We weren't answerable to shareholders. We really felt like we viewed this as a mission to be able to provide docs a significant premium over what they were getting paid, and also a value to hospitals to save some money using a physician-run company. And then really what I enjoyed was being able to help docs who were in these employed practices really at their wits' end, oftentimes ready to quit and leave or find something else. And once that pressure release valve came of, hey, I can actually get some call help here, and I only have to be on call 1 week in a month, that's more palatable. And so we were able to help kind of think all around.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's truly amazing. I, like yourself, meet a number of physicians who have become so comfortable with the chaos and thinking that this is just how it's supposed to be, and not understanding locums and how it can be really life-changing in how you practice medicine.
Yeah, absolutely. And they often feel I'm sure when you have these conversations like I do with docs, they feel very trapped. And I think that's by design.
It is.
A lot of times, it's very expensive for a hospital to lose a physician. So hidden in those contracts are various ways, whether that's deferred compensation or deferred call pay, or just difficult clauses that make it easy for the physician to leave, non-competes, et cetera. So yeah, I think it's very tough to be in a situation where you feel trapped. It's hard to provide the best patient care possible.
It is. It definitely is. And when the compensation doesn't match, like you
Right.
say, the poor quality of life that we sacrifice to do our jobs and take care of patients. Wow.
Absolutely.
So that's
So,
awesome. I really admire that you said, hey, let me figure out a way not only to help myself, but to help other docs figure a way out of the traditional practice of medicine. So how many docs do you work with in your company?
we have about 100 physicians right now that work for us at different times. We've really grown organically and through word of mouth. I've had kind of 3 stages. We've had 3 stages really of our company. The first one was just that we were providing call coverage for ear, nose, and throat. So it was very specifically, I really tried to stay super specialized. That was quite frankly really the only way that you can break into a market that has so many massive companies. I mean, CHG Healthcare is a $1 billion corporate, billion plus probably, and they own multiple locums companies. Jackson Healthcare, also a big healthcare holding company, owns multiple locums and staffing companies and VMS companies. So being very specialized, we're able to do that. And hey, we're going to provide ENT call coverage. During COVID, we noticed that there were a lot of more rural hospitals. So I'm talking in some cases really small hospitals, 25 bed hospitals that were looking to grow their service lines, whether that was in urology, orthopedics, or ENT. And Allie loves rural healthcare, as do I. It's a completely different way to completely different patient population. I love wilderness medicine and kind of making do with what you have and being able to provide the best care with limited resources. And that's really rural health. Mm-hmm. And you have other issues with, patients. If you're not there providing care in that space, they're not going to drive 2 hours or 3 hours to the nearest ENT. And so that was another area that, again, it was kind of a combination of business and kind of mission interests where we figured out kind of nuanced ways because it requires, you have to look at multiple different pain points and friction points of being able to provide those more advanced services in a rural area, but a way that it was a win-win all around. So for the hospitals to be able to get their cases, for the patients to be able to get that care, and then for physicians who were looking to really, as you were mentioning, like kind of make a transition rather than just these one-off call coverage, to be able to kind of transition their practice so that they can come and work a week a month or 2 weeks a month in an ongoing basis rather than just kind of filling in for weekends or holidays for docs.
I love that. You mentioned wilderness medicine. Did you complete a fellowship in wilderness medicine?
I did. I'm a fellow in the Academy of Wilderness Medicine. So I didn't do the year. Some of the ER and family medicine docs will do a really cool program. They have a couple in the country where they'll go and spend a year working in the Grand Canyon National Park or over in Washington. I did coursework to be able to get the fellow designation.
Awesome.
And that was great. I dragged Allie along for those, but we ended up having a great time. I have these awesome photos of her with a compass, 8 months pregnant, when we're doing our compass navigation.
That sounds fun. And I'm sure that was a very memorable pregnancy.
Yeah. And that was really before we were into rural healthcare. That was more because we were doing some mission work and, we were in some different countries, in several different continents, and I just wanted to be able to have kind of a basic understanding of those issues and nuances, and just kind of how to get. And we traveling with kids a lot, so for a while there, we were publishing on kind of traveling with your kids and specific kind of kits to take and things that are on the plane when you have a medical emergency. So just kind of, it was a way to keep myself kind of interested and excited about our field, without just doing the kind of the grind, the employment grind,
the typical stuff.
Yeah. So, that was great. And then rural healthcare was just a kind of a natural transition. And then essentially what happened then, so that was kind of the second phase. Now we provide we have physicians in all specialties. And the reason we decided to kind of make that leap is because it was probably late last year one of our main hospital clients, as we've been growing to different states, one of our large or early ones and largest ones switched over to something called a VMS, which is a vendor management system, which everybody who works locums as a physician or provider should be aware of. They are a middleman to the middleman. And so it essentially is a hospital or a hospital system will sign up with a vendor management system, and then the vendor management system will have different locums companies on their platforms. And then those, when a hospital has a job opening, they'll post it to that. And then all of these companies bid.
Okay.
And so you can make arguments both ways. And I see both sides because I'm in this weird position where I'm a physician caring for patients. I'm a physician who runs a locums company. And then I'm also kind of deep into the locums company side of things through the National Association of Locum Tenens. So I'm on their ethics committee. And so I kind of see it from all angles. And so I see both sides of the argument. But essentially what these systems do is the benefit for the hospital is it doesn't cost them anything to have these systems. But then they do get bids from different companies. From a locums company standpoint, obviously we don't love it because it's another fee. It's another middleman. It's another fee. It disrupts your communication, and a lot of times with your hospital. Some are better than others. We're on several of these platforms, and then so it's increased cost. And then the other thing is some of these VMSs are owned by larger companies, so are owned by other mega corporations that own multiple locums companies, and some platforms say they're vendor neutral, meaning anybody can bid, and then some say that they kind of, their companies they own get first dibs at it through various ways. Maybe not as on the nose as that, but essentially that's what's happening. So it's really a way that it's growing. It's not going anywhere. They're just getting bigger. As a physician, what I really don't love about it is it commoditizes us as physicians. So,
right.
And that's why I always talk to docs about direct contracting. When they call me up and are looking to work, I usually view it as, hey, I would rather you be able to direct contract in a really good situation and have several of those going than work through us. Because even though we take a really small fee, we're still a middleman technically. And most of the time though, it's still better to work through us for malpractice and for just kind of someone to manage that and be your advocate with the site. Oftentimes they'll pay a locums company more than they will the doc directly. And so that's still making more working with us specifically. But it does commoditize docs because, as you know, in your field, and as is certainly true in my case, the vast majority of docs are outstanding, and I let put tubes in my kids or take their tonsils out or do sinus surgery on me.
Yeah.
But not everyone's like that. And some people may be very skilled surgically, but they may not have the best patient bedside manner. They may not have the best respect and interaction with the staff. So those are things that are very important. And you really get lost when you're commoditizing and you're just kind of submitting they're just trying to submit CVs and bid rates. So, personally, I don't love that. I understand the business side of it. But now that we are on those platforms, as we've grown, it then allows us to kind of bid for those positions, which is kind of our third phase. I still enjoy, I think, most of all, the service lines that we're able to provide. Those are the ones where Allie and I will work the most when we are working clinically to either fill in for gaps or to get service lines going. Because that's really a way that, especially when you're able to get longer term contracts with hospitals, that the hospital knows the service line is going to be there. And then the docs we have come working with us have a lot more security in saying, okay, hey, for the next year of my life or 2 years of my life, I think
situation.
More stable than filling in here and there. You can plan a little bit better for those trips and those special events. Without worrying your job's going to get canceled with 30 days notice.
Right. And there are so many, because I work some rural contracts, and there's so many places where they're struggling for ENT coverage. It's very spotty. And, it's just better for patients that you're able to supply. And that's the thing that I love about locums, because everyone has their idea of what locums is. And it probably comes from false misconceptions about what a locums doctor looks like. But when I hear your story and how you're actually filling a gap within like healthcare essentially in a lot of these places that would not otherwise have ENT coverage. Like that is what this is about.
Yeah,
And a lot of people
absolutely.
don't see it from that lens. So I think
Right.
that is awesome.
Yeah, I mean, locums has grown so much, as you know, over the past 10 years. And it did used to be a doc that, okay, if you have someone in their like my age in their early 40s, like, okay, well, why are you working locums? Why aren't you able to like are you not get along with people, right? That's a common way
Yeah.
reason. Are you like you kind of like join a
Have a
private
bad
practice and have
record.
conflict? Yeah, have a
Yeah.
bad record, right? Like, and that's just not the case anymore. And in fact, it's they're getting credentialed so frequently that I think this may be a hot take, but I feel like it's harder to be a locums physician from a fact of, hey, if you have any marks on your record, if you have ever had any issues, it's probably going to be really difficult for you to do locums than if
Yeah.
you were to have been at a place for a while where you've been at a hospital, the same hospital with the same people for 10, 15, 20 years. You're not trying to recredential. I mean, you have the normal recredentialing, but it's different when
Yeah.
they know you versus you're coming in to a credentialing board that's never met you. They're truly just looking for any skeletons and any issues.
Anything.
So I think
Yeah.
our docs are outstanding. And we also have a pretty high standard. We really don't commoditize our docs either. Like we want to make sure they're a good fit with our company. They're going to be a
Absolutely.
good fit with the site because that is, I think, another value that we add is as physicians, we know what a patient's going to want from their physician. We know what the staff, what the person that's cleaning the OR between cases is going to expect or feel comfortable with, and that's what we want to be able to provide. And so when we're able to do that, we're able to maintain these relationships with these hospitals and then grow organically that way.
And that makes a difference. And you mentioned earlier the referral, like mainly, you get your docs by referral only. And so that's a key piece that that you're getting solid people because someone knows them and can attest to like their clinical abilities. That makes a big difference. So that's really awesome. There was something else I was going to ask you. You mentioned that you work with is it NALTO that you're working with, that you're on the ethics? Tell me more about that because I run into a number of docs who have horror stories. I've had some horror stories myself with different contracts or locums companies, actually hospitals. And a lot of times people don't know how to manage those situations, or specifically who can they call on to get guidance if they feel as if a locums company has maybe shared their CV without permission, or presented them without permission, and
Also
now
a
you're
big one,
locked into procurement with them and you had no idea. I think I always run into people who are breaking into locums or trying to get into it, and I caution everyone on freely sharing their CVs. I've heard things like watermark it, like specifically state what you're sharing the CV for to try and make sure that you're protected in some ways from that. But sometimes, what you don't know until you get into one of those situations. What's your advice to someone who's in one of those sticky situations?
Yeah, this is one thing that stood out when we had our conversation before, because this was a point that you brought up early and really, really made to be important. And I think it is. It's probably one of the most important things is your CV, right? Realizing that is not something that we think of it as, oh, we'll just send it along, of course, but there's a lot of ways that can be abused by recruiters and by locums companies. So what NALTO is the National Association of Locum Tenens Organizations, and it was founded, I think, about 15 or 20 years ago by actually some of the larger companies at the time. And now there's companies of all sizes that are a part of that. There's probably about 150 companies right now. So if you go to nalto.org, you can look and see the list of companies. And if you are going to work with a company, I would strongly recommend to work with a company through NALTO because it does provide protections for the docs from some of those scenarios that you described. But essentially, kind of the two big things that I see on the ethics committee that we get complaints about, well, three. One is, hey, they shared my CV and I never gave permission for that, right? And why that's bad is because if there's something called name clear, and so especially on these VMSs, it's a big issue. If hospital A posts this position for an ER physician, and you had talked to, let's say at some point, locums company B had gotten your CV, but they never said, even if they get your CV, that's fine. But if they've never explicitly said, hey, Dr. Goldsmith, can I present you with this opportunity? And you said yes. If that conversation not take place, then they shouldn't submit you. But what's happening a lot is, and it's unethical for our standards, is, okay, well, that recruiter that you spoke with 3 years ago has your CV on file. They submit you for that job. And then what happens, let's say even you reach out to the hospital, want a direct contract, or you find another locums company, you want to work through us, and we submit your name, and we've gotten explicit permission to do that. Your name won't clear because they have this database, and they would say, oh, you can't work with us. You've been submitted by someone else. And normally it used to be, oh, you could just say, well, that's not true. Here's, Dr. Goldsmith's going to spend this email saying she never approved that. Well, the hospitals don't want the liability. They don't want to be caught up in a fight. Yeah. And so there's a way to dispute it, but it costs the locum companies money through the VMS, like $1,000, $500, something like. There's some dispute process, but it costs a lot of money. It takes a lot of time, and so a lot of locums companies won't even bother to go through that.
They don't move forward. Yeah. Named and clear. It's
named and clear, and you may like. And the issue is it's not transparent pricing. So like we are probably paying 30% more than locums company B, but if they submitted your name without your permission, then it's unlikely, with all of the names being submitted, that the hospital's even going to want to take the time to dispute that, go through that.
Yeah.
So the kind of, if you're working with an Alto company, then it may not help for that job, but it certainly will help in the long term and your other colleagues. On the ethics committee, there's a way, if you go to the website, where you can submit a complaint, and you can say, hey, my name was submitted, I didn't give approval. And then we actually, one of my roles is I'll talk to the doc, I'll talk to the hospital, or not the hospital, the locums company, and we'll figure out if that happened. And then if it does happen, there are various levers that we can pull to either educate, or worst case situations, especially if it's a repeat offender, kick them off of the organization, so that they're not, because we want to protect locums. We don't want to get bad taste in the mouth.
Exactly. And that is really, really good to know, because I think a lot of people feel like, they're trapped into these situations, and now, and then in some way you are, if someone did that, like you said, there's a large fee to dispute that. And there's so many locums jobs at this point, people get away with it because it's like, why go through the drama of that? Just finding a job.
Why not just move on? And, but if it's still, to limit any of our opportunities as physicians is not good for us, the hospitals, or the patients. The other thing I see done uncommonly is what we call rusing. And so that's this idea that, hey, Dr. Goldsmith, I want to submit your CV to this ER job, and guess what? It pays $800 an hour, right? And you're like, sure, that sounds great. Your name gets submitted, and so now no one else can submit you. And they come back and like, oh, actually, it's not $800 an hour. It's $75 an hour. And obviously, that's an extreme example, but even $25 an hour or $50 an hour, that's consequential over time.
Exactly. That also sounds like, and I don't know if this is the same situation or maybe this is a different situation that comes up, but where a company submits you, but doesn't really advocate for you or try to make sure that you get the job, but now you're submitted, so now your name is tied up and you can't do that job. Whereas another recruiter might have gone to bat for you. Now my name is tied up, and this recruiter submitted me, and I never even heard back from them again.
Yeah. The other thing that I see, and this is kind of skirting the lines, right? Let's say they submit you and someone else, and they both tell you this rate, or maybe they tell you a higher rate. They tell Dr. C a lower rate. They can then they've cleared your names. You can't work with anybody else, but they may only offer it to the doc they can get for a cheaper price. Yeah. So those are all and that's a hard one to get around. That's where it comes down to the kind of what your colleagues say about the company and what their actual ethics as a company are. And if I'm able to find someone to come in and work for a less expensive rate, but I've told someone else, they're planning on this, we've submitted them, we're not going to do that. You don't undercut docs once you've kind of got at least a verbal agreement. And the other thing that we get complaints about, not uncommonly, is cancellation of shifts. And that is, I think, the biggest downside to locums is even in an employee job, you really don't have a lot of people saw this during COVID. A lot of times your pay can be cut, you can be let go. Even though you have this contract, there are ways that hospitals, especially with their
They will
deep
figure out a
pockets, can
way.
get out of it.
Yeah.
But locums is unique in that most assignments can be canceled with about 30 days notice. And so, if it's outside that 30 days, a lot of times the doc may not be aware of that. As you can imagine, from a recruiter standpoint, they're not really advertising that, right? They want to be able to submit your name. They want to, because each of those gives them bonuses. And another reason we don't use recruiters, we've never, used that model, but each of those steps, I got a CV submitted. Well, that's, on your metric, most likely, a bonus in the quarter. I've got this doc to confirmed, or I've got this doc started. I've got this doc to work this many shifts. So it's a whole system. But, getting your shift canceled, a lot of docs aren't aware that that's something that can happen with usually short notice. I consider, less than 90 days or 180 days, pretty short
Very
notice.
short. 30 days.
Yeah.
There's no way you're scheduled. You will find it very difficult to schedule a full month or whatever, like your full schedule in less than 30 days.
Yeah. And on these, it's pretty standard. I would say 30 days is for most locums docs, especially when they're working through a VMS or a larger company, the standard. And I agree with you. It seems incredibly short. Sometimes if they get canceled within that window, you should get paid for those shifts up to that window. Yeah. Even if you're not working. And sometimes, if locums company may try to not do that, they may cancel and so then as the ethics committee member, you have to kind of dig in and then discuss it. Hey, was this really the hospital canceling? Was this the locums company like finding a cheaper doc to work? Right. Like, I think that can happen sometimes. And, just knowing kind of almost like your bill of rights from a locums doc, you shouldn't have your CV submitted without your express consent and your name cleared for a certain site. What pay rate was discussed before should be honored. And then cancellation of your shift should be really clearly outlined and explicitly told to you as you're going through this whole process. Hey, they can cancel us within 30 days. If they don't credential you, if there's some issue that they can't credential you, or they don't get it done in time, like that may not, then the 30-day may not apply. So it's kind of the downside to it, but it's the important items to know.
And I usually give advice to my clients in terms of how do you start with a new company? How do you start with a new contract? I never overcommit because things always happen with credentialing. You don't want to have a full, month 12, for me, 12 shifts planned for this hospital, and you don't know if your credentialing is done, or you don't know what their cancellation patterns are. There's some companies that are notorious for canceling at the last minute and putting in full-time docs, only filling those spots with docs until they're able to get their full-time docs credentialed, and then they'll take you off the schedule. And that's just really unethical and unfair because like this is our livelihood. And so there are things that we can do to protect ourselves from that, as you mentioned, but definitely making sure in that contract that if the cancellation is less than 30 days, that there is, it's like explicitly says that they're going to compensate you for that time.
That's right.
So that is very, very key. But that's so helpful because in all the different Facebook groups, you always hear about the unethical things that a lot of these companies are getting away with.
Yep. And know that if they are, check to see if they're an Alto member. As a physician, I had a case I was investigating, and I could tell when the locums company, when I called them up to get their side of things, you're like, wait, you're a physician? Like they're like, yeah, this is, I see it from both sides for sure, which I think is a good perspective to have when you're investigating these things. 'Cause I feel like it can be pretty unbiased.
Yeah, absolutely. Have you heard of situations where, or even as a locums company, staffing company, where the contract management groups or hospital systems are not compensating docs for work?
So that does happen. And the thing is, as a doctor, that would be a big advantage to be working through a locums company. And it's interesting you bring this up because I just had this situation happen where I was actually doing it for, I've heard of this and I never had it because our hospitals have always, sometimes they'll be delayed, right? A little while, but usually they pay. And so the doc did his work several weeks filling in for someone who was out, but it wasn't a big organization. And they're like, well, we can't pay this. Right. And so what we do as a, financially sound locums company that's not, we pay the docs right away. So like that's a part of it. And then because they're with us, like that shouldn't be on the doctor. If our client can't pay us, like the doc will still get paid.
Right.
If you're direct contracting, that's a little bit of a, especially if you're working for a small practice or a really small hospital. I do due diligence on most of these hospitals. Most states, especially the nonprofits, require them to submit their financial forms. They may be a year or two delayed, but you can get some idea of how healthy they are. Certainly, if you're direct contracting and you're worried about paying, I mean, it would be, I say net 30 terms are reasonable for a company. Sometimes they'll want to do net 90. If you're direct contracting, I mean, the latest I would go with getting paid would be 30 days. If you're with a hospital, and you can make an argument for 2 weeks, really. I mean, because the risk then is you're working for a month and they're saying, oh, the check's in the mail and it's another 2 weeks, right? And meanwhile, you're waiting to get paid. So that's a big, I think, risk of direct contracting, especially with smaller hospitals. Sometimes the bigger hospitals, when you direct contract, the bureaucracy just gets in the way. They'll still pay it. It just kind of takes a while. But yeah, so I up until a few weeks ago had never encountered that. I'm dealing with that now. I think it'll all work out. But our doc got paid, right? He got paid right away when he was done. But as a company, we've always really focused on growing organically, making sure that we are growing through word of mouth, both with our hospitals and with our docs. And obviously, as physicians working as well, we have the ability to we don't have cash flow issues. But I think that's a lot of reasons why it's important to do your research on a locums company. I've noticed on Instagram, especially, there's a lot of different, whether that's kind of ways for docs to kind of direct contract, but through a platform, or new locums companies that I haven't heard of before. That it is very easy to start a locums company. It's not easy to keep one going, and it's not easy to do one well, right? Anybody can have a buddy who's a VP at a hospital and says they need a doc, and then start recruiting for one and promise the moon. But you want to make sure that it's a company that's been around a while, that's financially viable, that can be vouched for, I think is important.
Absolutely.
They should be able to give you docs that have worked for them before. And
you
then
want to be able to make sure your malpractice is going to be covered, that this company's not going to go.
Really, really good point, Dr. Goldsmith. I mean, that is huge. I just saw that there was a company that went out of business and didn't pay the tail. So all of these doctors who had worked for them, did you hear about that or read about that?
I
saw it somewhere.
I have not.
Yeah. I think they were largely staffing ER physicians. And so all these docs were then, they're left with, okay, they either have to go uncovered or they have to pay a really expensive tail.
There are a few companies actually who have done that, and that has affected not only locums doctors, but their full-time doctors. So yes, if that is what you're talking about, there's a couple companies where that has happened. And that's something that we've actually discussed on a national platform about how do we protect ourselves as ER doctors from those type of situations. So definitely,
you can have in your contract that the company pays the tail. So for those of your listeners who aren't aware, you have two types of malpractice policies. You have occurrence, and then you have claims made. And so claims made is specifically what we're talking about. It's probably 99.9% of the type of insurance you have if you're working with a locums company. And that means that essentially, I can see a patient on, January 1st and then never go back to that hospital again after January 2nd. If I have a claims made policy, again, that's what almost everybody who does locums has. The company that has paid for that policy has to continue to pay the premium because presumably they're still in business. Like us, our premium goes well up every year because we have more docs that we add, and we're then also covering the tail of the old docs. So you essentially, claims made is if that claim is then made 2 years later and it's in the statute of limitations, then the policy still has to be in force, or you have to have paid for that tail policy. And all of the locums contracts should say that the locums company is responsible for paying that tail, not the doctor. But if that company is no longer in business, then
Then
there's not much you can do.
exactly. So
Yeah.
that's why it's really important to know who you're working with, and
Right.
with the
Right.
number of calls and companies that reach out, it becomes overwhelming.
That's
And when
right.
they throw these high ticket offers in terms of like their contracts, it's enticing, especially to new docs who think locums is where the money is at. And
Right.
so I always, you have to find a sweet spot, because I always say if it's an extremely high rate, you gotta kind of raise your eyebrows and say, like, what are the issues? Is it an issue with the hot? Like, there has to be something that you have to tease out and make sure that it's a reasonable offer. So
yeah, and I've noticed too, social media, for all the good that comes with it, there's obviously a lot of bad, and I've noticed a lot of kind of overinflated numbers talked about. I mean, it gets views, but what it really does is makes us all feel kind of crummy about ourselves. Like, and I was talking, or actually Allie was talking to an ENT recently, and she was like, I saw on Instagram that an ENT made this much a day. And we're like, I don't think that's true, because that is more than I've ever even heard of us, like, even being able to bill a hospital, right? So there might be a one-off rare extenuating circumstance, but for the most part, like, that's the other thing I would caution is, like, if you want to be aware of the market, but if you see this really high rate and no one else is getting it, or maybe one person is saying that they got it, it's probably not like there's usually a catch. Not always, but usually.
Like I said, there's definitely usually a catch. And a lot of times, especially from an ER standpoint, when you're put into those situations, there's a reason why they're getting locums in there, and there's a reason why they're starting with that high number. And you have to figure out whether that's a facility or, practice environment that you can live in, and sleep well at night when you go home, before you kind of, put yourself into those positions. And I really think most of my long-term contracts have been, my consistent long-term contracts have been, maybe a little bit above market, but in a comfortable space where I know what I bring to the hospital. I know what I bring to my patients, where they don't mind, paying me even if it's a little bit more than what they
are. Those direct contracts?
So they are through a locums company, but the company is directly contracting with the hospital.
Gotcha. Yeah. And that's,
so
I find that
no contract management group involved.
Yeah, that's great. That's a great way to do it. That's my preferred way of working, direct contracting with the hospital, which is still probably 90% of what we do. But it's really useful too. Sometimes we'll have a doctor, like, let's say you knew this hospital that needed ER, and you think it would be a great opportunity. Sometimes the hospital is hesitant. They really want to work with a middleman or a locums company. They don't necessarily want to direct contract, whether they don't want to provide the malpractice, or they're concerned. They know that you justify that higher rate, but they would feel more comfortable if, from Stark laws, et cetera, if they can use a middleman. And that's where one area where I think we've been able to be very helpful too. We have a number of docs who've been in that situation. They really want to work at a site, but, and they've brought us the site. They've maybe worked with us before, but they know us. And so that's a great, like, really transparent process where we can say, hey, look, this is what we're charging them. This is what you're making. You brought us the site. And so, there, from a locums company standpoint, we are covering the malpractice, but we're also really just kind of doing just the paperwork.
Like you said, advocating for the doc.
For them. And that's a really great way then too. If a doc says, hey, they're going to direct contract me for this rate, but they want to go through a locums company, we can say, I think we can, probably get that up a little bit based upon what we know the market is. And, then it's not the doc going back and forth with the hospital. They have, almost like an agent working for them.
Nice.
Yep.
Well, I'm telling you, I've already learned so much about being a locum staffing company. And I think that you have the best of both worlds. You know what's going on the other side that's somewhat kept a mystery to most people who are, practicing locums. Most of the time, they don't want us to talk to each other. They don't want us to know what each other is getting paid. And so you end up sort of on an island and you don't really know what's going on the other side. So I think
Right.
this is very helpful to people who are interested in maybe starting a locums company, or people who are interested in just getting into locums. There's so much value in what you shared today. So I thank you for that. And I
Yeah,
want to
my pleasure.
shift gears and talk a little bit into lifestyle. What does you're married to another physician, you're both practicing locums. What does that look like? What does it look like for your family life on a day-to-day? How do you make locums work for your lifestyle?
Yeah, so Allie and I, we really love working together. I mean, we worked together in residency, and then took first jobs together. So we've always kind of worked together, whether that's one in clinic or one in the OR, or both operating together on bigger cases. And so that's something that we love. And I've talked to people who feel all across the spectrum while working with their spouse. Some who just can't do it. They don't like it. They don't get along. Some who really try to compartmentalize, their family time, their work time, their patient care time. I love our situation and setup. It's just kind of a hodgepodge mix, kind of all one big thing. So, we'll be traveling with the kids abroad somewhere, and one of us is replying to an email from one of our staff about a locums issue, or we'll be talking about a patient over lunch, or patient management, or surgery, or we'll be operating together. So it's kind of a whole. I think it's certainly unique, but something that works really well for us. As the company's grown, a lot of our time is spent managing that and working on that, and trying to make sure we can do the best that we can. But this fall we had our ENT meeting, our annual meeting, as most subspecialties do, and most specialties do. So we had that in October, and then we had a locums conference for locums companies a couple of months later. So it's kind of blending back and forth both worlds quite a bit. From a clinical standpoint, we do have a small private practice in my wife's hometown where our kids go to school. That I keep open really just because you'll have a teacher that needs their kids tonsils out or something, right? And it's nice to to be able to provide that.
To be able
Otherwise,
to
you'd be
help
waiting a
out.
while. Yeah.
Yes.
So that we just kind of keep open just for the heck of it. And then
That's awesome.
a lot of our clinical work, we do that maybe a day a week, and then a lot of our clinical work is at a certain more rural service lines. So rather that's we have a lot of military docs who work, if they get deployed or gone, if I'm nearby, we'll fill in. Or if we're starting a service line, usually that's where we're really helpful, is to get it up and going, especially if they never had ENT before. So that's kind of where we keep our ENT skills up. And then a lot of it, though, is more and more becomes admin work, which is enjoyable. But when I was first kind of dreaming up this idea with Allie, and she had started the company, and they were trying to figure out what it could be used for, it ended up being a lot harder than I thought. There's a lot of pitfalls, more and more, especially because with VMSs coming in, it's not an easy field to get into. If right now, I love what we're able to do for the hospitals and the patients in those rural places, and for the docs who are using our docs for call coverage, and for the docs who work with us who are able to make more and know that the site we're putting them in is a solid site. But man, I'd be lying if I didn't say I didn't have days where I dreamed of just being able to work for my buddy who had a locums company when I wanted, because there's a lot of headwinds, and I think we're going to be encountering more over the coming years. I think as people risk losing health insurance, I think as inflation has already, I've seen volumes go down at different hospitals.
Yeah.
The call coverage is something that I think is going to be less amply provided to employed docs. I think that as larger hospital system sees their revenue go down, if they have 4 docs employed, they're probably going to lean on them to, take all the call rather than have locums fill in here and there. So, a lot of headwinds, but still, I think depending on the type of setup, a lot of good ways to really do an alternative career. But certainly I do have my moments when I'm like, man, I wish I could be the one just working with someone.
Yeah, I can see that. Definitely. Being an entrepreneur is not an easy task, and
it has its ups and downs
for sure.
Yeah.
So tell me, what's next for you?
Yeah, so what I'm really hoping to do here over the next probably the next 2 years is, I do think that the service line space is really one that is a useful one, and one that does have a win-win-win all around. And so we're really leaning into that. We're really working with hospitals to figure out a way that they can make it financially viable, as almost as a way to counter the fact that maybe they're largely a primary based, or maybe they have a few general surgeons, but they're seeing their revenues go down. If we can bring in these specialty practices through our kind of tried and true way and continue to grow those or start new service lines, I think that's a way that those hospitals will stay financially viable. So really am leaning into that. From a VMS standpoint, I mean, we have access to all of these different jobs throughout the country now in all specialties, because for our size, we've been able to get on a large number of these platforms. So I'm really working on getting the word out to other doctors that, like, hey, I think we're a really good alternative to work with, that will pay you more, that will be straightforward and ethical, and be able to give you a really good locums experience. We don't have recruiters, so that's largely through word of mouth, which is easy in the specialty world. But as you get into primary care and other areas that we don't have personal connections with, or through our professional network connections with, I'd love to see that continue to grow as docs who work with us tell other docs about us. And so that's what we're seeing, that's what we're doing, and I think that the VMS side of things is something that I hope that from those companies that own those platforms, that it really becomes more of a way for docs to benefit more than I feel like they are right now, and being very commoditized. And so I think that looking at other metrics for those physicians, besides just their pay rate, the lowest, it's a race to the bottom. Like, okay, well, I have Doc A who will take this much an hour, but Doc B who will take, $10 an hour less. I mean, I'd love to see those platforms shift more from being someone who's licensed who can do it for the lowest rate, to more of a 360-degree perspective on the doc. And that's what we provide to our clients, is like, hey, these are our patient satisfaction scores for these doctors. These are our staff satisfaction scores. So I'd really love to see that, so that the quality of the doc that you're getting, beyond just whether or not they can pass credentialing and do it for the lowest rate, is made more of a value to hospitals through those platforms.
Absolutely.
Don't know how to do that yet, though. I'm working on it.
Yeah. So tell me, or tell our listeners, where can they find you for more information, to learn about, your company?
Yeah. So our website is specialtylocums.com. We're also on Instagram at Specialty Locums. And that is probably the easiest way to reach out to us. info@specialtylocums.com is our email address. And we have a number you can chat with as well, or call anytime that's on that website. For those ENT listeners that you have, that is our where we started. That's our area that we're still practicing, and that's entlocums.com. So those are our ways to best reach us.
And your podcast?
Yeah, podcast, Let's Locums. Yeah. So I have a couple of episodes I'm really proud of. Yours being top of the list.
Thank you.
I did get to have Dr. Goldsmith on there. And so that's on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, called Let's Locums. I just did one that I really enjoyed. There's a doc, an ENT named Caleb Masterson, who I actually found on Instagram. He popped up, and he's an ENT in like rural Alabama.
Wow.
And but he's really a creative guy. And so we had our national meeting, and I reached out to him. I was like, hey, I have this podcast. I know you don't do locums, but like, you're an ENT. And I've always wanted to like record live on like the expo floor. So like, how on CNBC, how they're the squawk box or whatever, they're like sitting up there and they get all the activity behind them. So we set that up, and that was a lot of fun. So I knew if anybody would be game, he'd be game. So we recorded that one. That was fun. And then another episode I enjoy that I'd recommend is called The Worst Locum Tenens Experience in History. Went down a number of rabbit holes, but I was talking to a buddy about a bad experience he had when he first started. And then I had another kind of thing that popped up that the more I explored it and went down different rabbit holes, I was like, oh man, this is truly found the worst locum tenens experience in history. So that's
I gotta
that's
check.
my
I gotta check
one of my
those out. I gotta check those out.
yeah.
I definitely do. Well, Mark, this has been such a powerful conversation. What really stands out is how locums wasn't just a career detour for you. You like created a platform. You're helping other doctors. You're helping patients, and it seems like it really aligns with the lifestyle that you desire and see for your family, yourself and your family. Your journey reminds us that physicians don't have to choose between clinical excellence and entrepreneurship, that you can actually design a career that holds both those at the same level. So thank you for sharing your insight and being honest and giving us the blueprint for what's possible when we stop playing small. So thank you so much for joining us
Well,
today.
thank you so much for having me as a guest. I really enjoyed chatting with you again.
Yes, thanks.
Thank you for tuning in to this week's episode of the Locums Lounge with Dr. Mimi. I hope that you leave feeling inspired to at least consider how locums can change your lifestyle as you practice medicine. Be sure to check out my website at thelocumslounge.com and follow us on Instagram at The Locums Lounge. Look forward to hearing from you next week, and thank you for tuning in. Until next time, have a great week.